Hi guys, Ernest from LiFePO4 Oz, and I'm going to do an updated video about the B-Series JK BMS and its settings. Now, it's going to be quite a long video, so what I'm going to do is put a timestamp in the description where each one of the settings is going to be covered. So if you're impatient like me, you can skip through to the setting that you would like to see. Otherwise, watch the full thing to see all the settings and the explanations. But let's jump into it. Okay, so I'm going to go through the settings of the B-Series JK BMS. Now this is going to be for a 16S configuration. However, the same settings pretty much apply for a 4S or an 8S or pretty much whatever voltage you're going to run. First of all, you need to download the app. Now you can either do it a couple of ways. You can go to our website, for example, and then go into any one of the battery kits. And then once you've clicked on one of the battery kits, if you scroll halfway down, you'll see documents and videos. And under there, you should see the JK BMS app download link for both iOS or Android. So that's one way that you can do it. Another way you can do it, go into the App Store. And then in here, if you search for JK BMS, search, and you can see that here is the app here. This is what it looks like. And so if you're in iOS or Apple, it'll be in the App Store, or if you're a Android, it'll be in the Google Play Store. Now, I've already actually downloaded it. Okay, so I'll just click open. Now, when you first go into the app, make sure that you've got your BMS turned on, and it will actually it'll actually find any of the BMSs in the local area. So you can see here that I've already got one set up, BMS1, so I'll click on that.
So one thing I'll mention as well is the very first time you log into your JK BMS, you do need to actually pair your Bluetooth, so your phone Bluetooth with the JK BMS. So the default password is 1234. Once you've entered that in the first time and paired your phone with the JK BMS, you won't need to do it again.
Now, once it's logged into the BMS, you'll see that it's got a number of settings on this home status page. It'll tell you what the voltage is of the pack. It'll tell you if any amps are actually coming in or out of the bank. And you'll see that there's an array of different settings, not settings, but what it's reporting on. Battery power, battery capacity, remaining capacity, a heap of different information there. Moving down, you'll see that there's the voltages of each one of the cells, and you'll see that they're jumping around at the moment, which, you know, is normal. Don't worry about the red or the blue. The red just simply means that's the lowest charged cell, and the blue means it's the highest charged cell in that bank. Moving further down, you'll see that there are the cell wire resistance, and we'll jump into that in a second. But basically, if you measure the wires on your BMS, that's what it should be, and you can calibrate that in the settings if you need or want to. I've never done it. I've never seen the need to do it. All the battery banks that we set up work fine without having to calibrate it. But if you feel like you need to do that, then I'll show you how to do that. Now, I'll show you here when we're on the home page, if you want to rename your BMS, because if you've got a number of different packs, you can click on the Bluetooth icon, top left, and on the pencil, and modify name, and you can go ahead and rename that if you want to. Okay, so that's how you rename your BMS. Also, the other thing as well is if you click on the top right status bar, you'll see that you've got a couple of different options here: system log, details log, history version, privacy and protocol, language settings, and about. Okay, now to set up the settings, we're going to first click on the settings at the bottom of the page. That will take us into the first settings here. Now, I can't actually edit anything until I verify this password. Now, default password is typically 123456. Mine is 112233. Now, if you want to modify this password, you'll see here that we can click in and we can modify it. And if you wanted to modify it, you could put in what your old password is. Again, by default, it'll be 123456. Okay, and then you put in what your new password would be. So whatever it needs to be. I believe it needs to be 6 digits. If you put in 4, it mightn't work anyway, but that's how you can modify your password. Okay, now, once you've verified your password, you can go in and you can see that there's an array of settings that I can now edit. Okay, however, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return these settings back to their default. And there's an easy way to do this. You'll see at the top there that there's different types of battery chemistries. And if you click on the LiFePO4 battery settings, it will return the settings back to the default. Now this is really dangerous if you've already, not dangerous, but an inconvenience if you already set up your settings. The reason being is that as soon as you click on that button, it will actually set all these back to what it was previously. So I'm going to do that. And it's asking me for confirmation. I'll go yes. Okay, and you can see now that it's actually returned all the settings back to the default settings as you should see them. So you can see here the cell count is 24. I'm going to change this to 16 and I'll click OK. The battery capacity, now I'm working with 100 amp hour cells. You put in what your battery capacity is. So if you've got 280 amp hour cells or 314 amp hour cells, put that in, but I'll just put in 100 here. Okay, now the next one, balance trigger volt. Now this setting here relates to when the BMS should start to balance cells. Now I've currently got mine to set at 0.01. I'm happy to leave it at that. However, this also, there's another setting in here which we'll go through in a second, which it won't start to balance the cells until it's over that voltage. And this one here is just the differentiation between two cells when they start to balance. So again, I'll leave it at that. Now the next two cells settings are calibration settings. To be honest with you, they're not really worth worrying about in my opinion, but if you want to update it, so for example, if you got a multimeter and you wanted to update the calibration, then what you could do is measure the voltage of the pack with a multimeter or with your shunt. And if instead of saying 51.54, it might have said 52 or it might have said 55 or whatever, yeah, you can go in here and you can calibrate that and click OK. Again, I've never really had to do it. I always choose the BMS as being the truth and never really had to update it, but if you want to do that, you can do it. Same with the calibrating current. Okay, so if you've measured the current using a current clamp, and you find that the current is something different to what the BMS is reporting, you can go in here and update that setting and it will set it to whatever you set it to. Okay, moving down, so the start balance volt. So this setting here is the setting that I was telling you about, that it needs, all the cells need to get above that setting in order for the balance trig volt. So in order for this one to go above there. Currently I've got it set to 3. I normally change it to about 3.2. There's other people that change it to 3.4, which I think is too late in the charge profile, but if you want to do, that's up to you. I've never had any problems with setting it to 3.2, and to be honest with you, all the packs I set up are pretty well balanced all the time. Next one down, max balance current. So this setting here is basically how much current do you want to actually balance by. The BMS that we're working with has a 2 amp active balancer built into it. Okay, I use the full 2 amps. If you wanted to change it down to 1 amp or something like that, that's how you do it. I've never changed it down or felt the need to change it down. Okay, the next one down is cell OVP, which stands for Over Voltage Protect. So Over Voltage Protect basically is what's the maximum that you want any one of these cells to get to. Now, it's up to you, like 3.65 is the absolute maximum that you should charge any LiFePO4 cell to. At the very top and at the very bottom of the charge profile, these cells by characteristics move a lot of voltage for very little capacity. In other words, as soon as it gets up above around 3.55, 3.6, it doesn't really need a lot of amps to be going in to move the voltage up. So I even build in a little bit more safety into my packs. I'll lower that down to maybe 3.2. Now, previously I used to set it to 3.6, but you'll see in a second why. I'm happy to set that to 3.62, or this next one, which is cell RCV. Okay, so RCV is the requested charge voltage. Okay, now this is the recommended charge voltage multiplied by the number of cells. It's basically for your charger or your inverter with what voltage that you want to charge at. Okay, now I set this to 3.61. The reason being is it needs to be below the OVP, so it needs to be below whatever that setting is. So you'll see if I try and set it to 6.2, it's going to have a sending failure. okay? And even though it's left it at 3.62, it doesn't save it. But if I change this back to 3.61, guess what? It saves, okay? So that's basically what the requested charge voltage will be. And then what happens with your inverter or your charger, okay, is it times it by the number of cells to, that will be your voltage, okay? Okay, SOC 100%. Okay, this is what do you want your pack to recognize as 100% charged. Now, again, it can't be 3.61, okay? Again, if you try and do that, it'll produce a failure. So I set it to 3.6, okay? Next one is cell OVPR. So this is over voltage protect reset. So in other words, what will happen is it will charge up typically to your 3.65, okay? And then once it hits that, or any one of the cells hits that, okay, it's basically going to stop allowing charge to go into the bank until it comes back down to whatever the setting is. Okay, so this is the reset to allow charge to start going back into the pack. So it's currently set to 3.4, which I think is a little bit low. I think 3.55 is fine, so that's what I set mine to. Okay, next one down is cell UVPR, which is cell under voltage protect reset. Okay, now I set this to 3.1. Okay, where do I want my 0% to be? So I use 80% depth of discharge in my cells, and these settings here are typically around that. At the top it's a little bit under, and at the bottom it's around that. I set mine to 3 volts, which is a little bit under. If you want to use more than that, then you can lower your SOC down further, but that's where I set mine to. Okay, what is the absolute bottom end of the charge that you want? Now, 2.5 is where the bottom end, or if you look at most spec sheets, that's the very lowest voltage that you want for your cell. But I set this to 2.9, again, to try and maintain that 80% depth of discharge approximately. Okay, power off. So power off, this is where do you want the BMS to actually turn off if it's got to this voltage. So even if the discharge has stopped at 2.9, you might have the BMS is obviously still using a little bit of power, and if you're not watching the bank and you've walked away for a couple of days, if not a couple of weeks, it'll continue to discharge. So this is the setting or the voltage that as soon as any one of these cells reach this, the BMS will actually turn off. So I'll put it at 2.5. Okay, so cell RFV stands for reference float voltage. Okay, so this is basically a communication setting where if you've got communication with your charger or your inverter, the charger will go into a float mode after the absorption charging phase. Okay. Next one is Vol Sleep Smart Sleep. Okay, now this is actually a setting that if you set, it basically needs to be turned on with a setting in the controls. This is the voltage that if it's underneath this voltage and there's basically no activity, so no current going in and out, it starts a timer and then eventually the BMS will turn off if there's nothing happening after a period of time. I don't really, this one here, so 3.35 times the time smart sleep in hours. Okay, now basically this is the timer for the above setting, the voltage smart sleep, and this is the timer. So you can see at the moment it's set to 24, which basically means that if there's no activity for 24 hours, and if we go into the settings, you've got this smart sleep setting turned on, okay, it will actually turn the BMS off, or the BMS will go into that sleep mode. Okay, next one going down is the continued charge current. Okay, so right now it's set to 40. Now this is a 200 amp BMS. Now I might set this to 150, for example. It's a 200 amp BMS, so you can even set that up to 200, but whatever you want to do there, that's just basically where you limit the charge current to for the BMS. Okay, next one is charge OCP delay. Okay, so this is the delay for the over current protection. Okay, if you found that the charge, okay, is coming in, and in this instance it's gone over 150 amps, okay, this is how long you want it to go over 150 amps before the BMS reacts. Okay, so I might put that at say 3 seconds, for example. Okay, so in other words, if it goes over 150 amps, it'll wait for 3 seconds and then it will basically stop allowing charge to go into the bank. The next one is Discharge OTP, which is Over Current Protection Reset. So once it's gone over that 150 amps, it's going to wait 3 seconds, stop allowing charge to go into the bank or into the BMS. How long do I want the BMS to wait until it will to allow the BMS to start absorbing charge again? I'm going to set it to 30 seconds. Again, it's up to you what you want to do, but usually if you've got a charger that has come up and triggered this, the BMS is not going to allow any more charge to go in, and the charger is going to go, there's an issue there, and stop. That's typically what will happen. Okay, continued discharge current. Okay, again, this is a 200 amp BMS. If you're using a 5 kilowatt 48 volt charger, it's 104 amps going as a discharge. This is the same thing here. This is what's the maximum discharge current that you want to allow out of the BMS. So Discharge OTP is the Discharge Over Current Protect. Okay, so same thing as with the Charge OTP. What is the maximum amount of time, okay, in seconds before the BMS will disconnect? And again, I'll put this to 3 seconds. Now it's having an issue, so I'm guessing 10 is the minimum. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to set it to 10 seconds. Okay, so that's how long the Discharge OTP delay will be. So I'll wait 10 seconds until the discharge is over 150 amps, and then I'll stop allowing any discharge to be coming out of the BMS. The next step is the reset time. So how many seconds do you want to wait until it will allow discharge to happen out of the bank again? So again, I'll leave it at 30. Next one down is the temperatures. Okay, so where do you want Discharge OTP? This is a temperature. What temperature do you want so for example, if discharge is set to 70, okay, once it goes over 70 degrees, it's not going to allow the discharge to continue. Next one is the reset value. So same thing, over temperature protect reset for discharge. So again, it'll go up to 70 degrees. It will start allowing any discharge to happen, and then as soon as it goes under 60 degrees, it will allow it. So I'm happy to leave those settings there. And again, this is ambient temperature, so it depends on what you're doing there. Same thing with the next two settings. So Charge OTP is Charge Over Temperature Protect, and then the next one down from there is OTPR, which is when is it going to reset. So if you've got both of these set to 70 as the protect and then 60 as the reset, that's where anytime it goes up to 70 degrees, it'll stop allowing charge or discharge, and then as soon as it gets under 60 degrees, it will allow the charge or the discharge to continue. Next one down is your Charge UTPR, which is the under temperature protect reset. The one below it is UTP, which is under temperature protect. It's currently set to -10 now. So UTP I set to 0, and then UTPR I set to 1. And so basically it'll come down to 0. It'll stop allowing any charge coming in, and then once it gets above 1 degree, it'll allow charge to get in. Now you can run it a little bit lower, but I just like to be a little bit safer than sorry, so to speak. So that's the settings that I use. The MOS OTP, which is the MOSFET. So basically that's the transistor in the BMS that allows current to go in and out. It's currently set to 80. Look, I think that's fine, especially if you think that you're going to be getting up to around 50 with the ambient temperature. If you wanted to drop it down, just make sure that you drop down, depending on what you want to do, but it's got to be above whatever this reset value is. So if you wanted to change it to say 60 as a reset value, then you can go back and change this to 70 if you want, okay? But the over temperature protect must be higher than the reset value when you're trying to change the values. Okay, the SCP stands for Short Current Protect Delay. Okay, this is basically if the BMS detects a surge in current, typically caused by a short circuit, how many seconds, or actually microseconds, okay, do you want to actually wait until the BMS disconnects? Okay, so it's currently set to 5. If you wanted to change that down to 3 seconds, then you can do that. Okay. SCPR stands for Short Circuit Protect Reset. So it'll wait 3 microseconds to disconnect for a short circuit. Okay, but then how long do you want the BMS to wait until it will allow the BMS to again receive discharge or charge? Okay, I've got this set to 30, which I think is fine. That's it. Okay, next one down is the device address. Now, if you're using multiple BMSs and you're communicating with an inverter or with something, okay, this is typically where you can set which one's which. For this BMS, it might be 1. For your second BMS, it might be 2. For the third BMS, it might be 3. So this is just a device address if you're using multiple BMSs and you're communicating. Okay, data store period. Okay, this is how long you want the BMS to actually store data. Okay, now it's in seconds, so 3,600 seconds is 1 hour, and if you activate that setting in controls, this is how long it will actually store the data for. Okay, so RCV stands for requested charge voltage, and this is basically how long the BMS will hold at the absorption charge. Okay, now I changed that from 0.5, or if you want to leave it at 0.5, that's fine. I change it down to 0.1. Next one is the requested float voltage. Okay, so this is how long the BMS will hold the battery at the highest absorption voltage before it switches to the lower float voltage. Okay, so it's currently set to 5 volts. 5, which is, again, this is in hours, right? So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to change this to 0.5. Okay, next one down is the emerge time minutes. Okay, so the emerge time minutes, again, it's in minutes. Okay, this is a setting or a timer that if you turn off the emergency time in the control, it will wait 30 minutes, okay, until it will turn it off. Now, the emergency setting is basically where you can turn it on. If you turn it on, basically it's going to ignore most of these safety settings, so your over voltage, your over current, all that sort of stuff. If you don't need to turn it on, I recommend that you don't turn it on. But this is a timer that if you turn that on, it will wait for this long and then turn it off. I think that 30 minutes is a long time, so I'm just going to change this to 5 minutes. Okay, and so basically it'll ignore these safety parameters for about 5 minutes, and then it'll reactivate it. Okay, so the user private data is just a custom field that if you're communicating with different devices, this is how it's going to identify what the BMS is or what the unit is. So you can change this if you want. I've never actually really used it, but it's for when you're communicating with other devices, it being able to identify which device you're talking to. Okay, so user data 2 is just, again, another custom field when sending information or communicating with another device. With the UART1 and the UART2, these are pretty much the same, except you've got 2 different UART communication protocols. If we go into them, you can see there that there's different RS485 communication protocols. So this is basically the protocol that the JK BMS can communicate. So if you wanted to talk to potentially a Growatt, a pylon system, or even a Growatt BMS, then you can go through and you can choose that one there. I just leave it on this. I've never communicated with another battery or anything like that, or inverter through the RS485, but you can see there that basically both the UART 1 and 2 are exactly the same. Okay, moving down, the CAN communication, that's to do with naturally communicating through the CAN, and this is the language or the protocol. So you can see in here that we've got a number of different inverters that you can communicate with out of the box or pre-programmed into the JK BMS. I run a video where we actually communicate with the Deye inverter, which you can go and check out that video if you want to see how to do that, communicate with the inverter through the CAN communication. But that's basically what that setting is relating to. Okay, moving down to the LCD buzzer trigger. Okay, this one here is basically with the JK BMS, you can set it up so that it has a audible buzzer, and even you can set up a screen so that if there is an issue with the battery, then it will sound an alarm. So you can see here that there's a number of different options here that you can set if there is an issue. So for example, low voltage SOC, which is state of charge, the battery over voltage, battery under voltage. So you can see here that there's a number of alarms that you can set. And then you can set number 10, which my understanding is that's for all of, if you want the alarm, any system alarm, so high voltage, low voltage or anything, that will trigger the alarm. Or you can be specific about any one of the ones that you want to select. Okay, and then 00 is just off. I don't have a buzzer that's connected, so I'm happy to leave that as off. The LCD buzzer trigger value. Okay, now what this relates to is when will the alarm trigger. Basically, if you've got it set to 100, it basically means that when 100% of the LCD buzzer trigger is met, then it will sound the alarm. So if you've got everything, a system alarm, it just basically means that as soon as a system alarm go off. However, if you've got a charge over current like this one here, okay, it basically means that as soon as that reaches that alarm, it'll go off. Okay, the next one down is the LCD buzzer release value. Okay, so when do you want the buzzer to release? Now at the moment it's 95, so in other words it basically says that if it's 95% of the value which triggers the alarm, once it gets below 95%, the alarm will turn off. So if you've got, for example, maybe a cell over voltage as the setting, and you've got your cell over voltage set to, cell over voltage protection is 3.62 at the moment. Okay, so if you've got that set to 3.62, then when it gets to 100%, so it actually reaches that, the alarm will go off. When it gets to 95% of that value, that's when the alarm will stop. Okay, so that's basically those two settings there. Below that, we've got our continued wire resistance. Now, as I mentioned before at the very start of this video, you can actually set or calibrate the resistance of each of the wires. I've never actually done it and never felt the need to do it. Okay, but if you measure your wires and you find that each wire has got a different resistance value to what it shows on the home screen just down the bottom here, then you can go in and you can update that and that'll help calibrate it. Now that's all the settings in this JK BMS that you need to worry about. Now the next screen you'll see is control. Okay, now under control there's a number of different settings that you can turn on and off. So the first two you can see is charge and discharge. Okay, this is basically if you're going to allow charge or discharge to come in or out of the bank. Now if you've set up the BMS and you're then going to be connecting your wires from the battery to your inverter, and you don't want to have sparks or anything like that happening, then it's great to turn off the charge and the discharge just so that there's nothing flowing through the bank. Okay, the next one is the balance. Okay, do you want your bank to balance with each other? So currently I've got that on. If I go back to the settings, you'll see that up the top, over on the top right, you'll see balance is on. Now the cells here are pretty much balanced, okay, but you can see here that obviously they're jumping around a little bit, and that's the BMS balancing the cells. Okay, so that's turned on. Emergency. Now emergency is the setting that I was telling you about before in here, where we've got the emergency time minutes. Okay, now as I mentioned before, if you turn this on, okay, basically it forgets doesn't forget, but ignores all the safety parameters that you've put in, and it will actually just allow the BMS to accept charge and discharge. Okay, what it will do is it will wait for the timer, so this one here, okay, until that goes to 0. It waits 5 minutes, okay, and then it will turn off this emergency timer. Again, my suggestion is not to use it if you don't have to. As I said, it ignores all the safety parameters that you've put into the BMS, so it can be potentially dangerous. Okay, disable the temperature sensor. So obviously with the BMS, it's got a couple of temperature sensors, and so if you turn that on, it will ignore whatever those sensors are. Again, probably useful in the fact that if you find that your temperature sensors are faulty and it's not allowing charge to go in and out of the bank, then good for that. Apart from that, I'd always leave it off, so always have your temperatures sensors working. Next one is the display always on. Okay, so this is with if you've got a display for the BMS, do you want it to always show on, or do you want it only show when you know, you've tapped it or something like that. So again, up to you if you want to have it on or off. Smart sleep on. Okay, going back to the settings. Okay, you'll see that up the top here, we've got a vol smart sleep voltage. Okay, that's how long the what do you call it? That's the voltage that once all the cells are above that voltage, okay, or sorry, below that voltage, okay, and the next one below is time smart sleep in number of hours. So in other words, if all the cells are below 3.35 voltage and no current has gone in or out for 24 hours, then the BMS will turn off. Now, it'll only turn off if you have this setting turned on. So the smart sleep setting, if that's turned on, then the BMS will basically go to sleep. Okay, time stored data. Okay, going back to the settings again, we've got the setting, where are we? Time stored, sorry, here it is here. So data stored periods. Okay, it's set to 3,600. Again, this is how long it will store the data if you have this setting on. So time stored data, if you have that turned on, it'll only store the data for 1 hour or whatever the setting you've got in there, and then it'll forget it. I've got it turned off. Okay, charge float mode. Okay, so if you've got this turned on, okay, and again, coming back to the settings, we've got it in here, which is the float voltage value. Okay, if we've got these values in here, just here, if you've got this turned on, basically what will happen is the pack will come up to the 100%, so and then what it'll actually do is wait the, where are we, the timer. Okay, so it'll wait, say, half an hour, okay, and then it'll drop down to this voltage here, which is your vol cell requested float voltage. Okay, so if you've got that setting turned on, it'll enable that. Now, it'll only basically do that if you've got communication with your inverter. Dry alarm, so the dry arm intermittent, this basically is an external programmable function for the BMS to control external devices like a relay or based on different state of charge or anything like that. So that's what that setting is for. Okay, so Discharge OCP, which is Over Current Protect 2. So this is basically just the second layer in terms of the over current protection when discharging this. But that's basically it. So if you want to go through the video, and if you've got any questions about the video, feel free to reach out through LiFePO4Oz.com, or feel free to give us a call on 1300 375 257. Apart from that, that's it.